On a summer night in Walsall, a violent ambush shook the West Midlands. 5 men sitting in a car on Reedswood Lane found themselves boxed in by 2 other vehicles. Within seconds, they were under attack. Machetes swung, baseball bats shattered windows, and 4 gunshots rang out at close range. The victims, covered in blood and clinging to life, somehow managed to drive themselves to Walsall Manor Hospital, where staff were confronted with a scene resembling a war zone. Multiple gunshot wounds, deep lacerations, shattered bones, injuries that would scar the victims for life. This wasn't random. It was a meticulously planned assault carried out by a local gang hell-bent on sending a message. The group, armed to the teeth and coordinated in their movements, had orchestrated a targeted, premeditated act of street warfare. The motive? Likely revenge. The method? Pure brutality. In the aftermath, detectives from West Midlands Police launched a major investigation. CCTV, mobile phone data, and forensic analysis pieced together the movements of the attackers. Over time, 8 men were identified and charged, not just with grievous bodily harm, but with possession of firearms and intent to endanger life. What followed was a case that exposed the harsh reality of gang violence in Walsall. The violence on Reedswood Lane didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the climax of a simmering feud rooted in long-standing rivalries among Walsall's gang landscape. While the full details remain guarded in court documents, what's clear is that the 8 men involved in the July attack had been operating within a loose network of criminal associations, one with a history of tit-for-tat confrontations, territorial disputes, and mounting aggression. At the center of the planning were men like Ammar Shahzad, Muhammad Sajid, and Haysar Ayaz, individuals already known to police, with prior involvement in violent offences. These weren't amateur offenders. They understood how to move under the radar, how to use multiple phones to avoid detection, and how to assemble a group of trusted enforcers when needed. The group's core members weren't part of a single branded gang, but rather a coalition drawn together by a shared enemy and a willingness to inflict maximum damage. The trigger for the attack is still unclear. Some sources suggest a recent confrontation involving disrespect or encroachment on drug territory. Others point to a more personal vendetta between 2 men from opposing groups. What's certain is that this was no heat-of-the-moment street brawl. The attackers had gathered weapons in advance, machetes, cricket bats, and a loaded firearm, and coordinated their arrival in multiple vehicles. This was a planned mission of violence intended to intimidate and disable, not simply scare. Crucially, the group relied on an informal structure. No central leader, but a shared plan and mutual agreement to carry it out. Their strength was in numbers and familiarity. They had moved in similar circles for years, knew the layout of local estates, and had access to safe transport, weapon stashes, and support networks that allowed them to strike hard and disappear quickly. But this attack would prove too brutal, too public, and too traceable. What made this incident particularly chilling was how rooted it was in a pattern of retaliatory violence that had quietly taken hold in parts of Walsall. Over the previous year, West Midlands Police had noted an increase in violent altercations, stabbings, and threats linked to unresolved disputes between rival groups. These weren't high-profile gang wars, but rather a steady build-up of local tension, punctuated by social media taunts, territorial posturing, and small-scale confrontations that rarely made headlines. The men involved in the Reedswood Lane ambush were part of that culture. Some had been victims of previous attacks. Others had reputations to protect. In their world, respect was currency, and silence was armor. When violence occurred, it was rarely reported. Disputes were settled in stairwells, back streets, or, as in this case, through organized retaliation. That underlying environment made a violent event like this not just possible, but almost inevitable. The origins of the attack weren't just personal. They were systemic. While not a traditional gang in name, the Walsall attackers functioned with the structure and coordination of an organized crew. Each man played a role in the execution of the assault, from transportation and surveillance to armed engagement and cleanup. In the weeks leading up to the attack, mobile phone records and CCTV footage revealed a flurry of contact and movement between the individuals involved. Meetings were held, weapons sourced, and vehicles arranged, all under the radar of law enforcement. The key players, including Cameron Moore, Shazad Mahmood, Khurram Sajid, and Wahid Abbas, brought with them a shared criminal history. Many had convictions for violence or possession of weapons. They were no strangers to confrontation, and they knew the value of planning. This wasn't a spontaneous act. The group had tracked the movements of their targets, ensuring they would be together in a vulnerable spot before striking. Their network operated with low-tech communication methods, multiple burner phones, coded language, and in-person meetings to avoid surveillance. Surveillance footage later showed some of them scoping out the scene days in advance. Others had been tasked with moving weapons into position, storing them safely before the night of the ambush. Everything was designed to limit exposure and maximize impact. 2 vehicles were sourced specifically for the attack, neither traced back directly to any one defendant. Inside those cars were blunt force weapons and at least one loaded firearm, which was later confirmed to have been discharged 4 times at close range. The planning involved knowing escape routes, ensuring mobile phones weren't active during critical moments, and disposing of evidence immediately after the hit. Despite the planning, cracks emerged. Forensic traces were left behind, CCTV caught multiple faces, and mobile data eventually pieced together the night's events. Phone tracking placed the men in convoy, arriving on Reedswood Lane just before the assault. Their network was built for violence, but it was never designed to withstand a determined investigation. Ultimately, what they built wasn't a criminal empire. It was a temporary alliance for a single act of extreme violence. And it was already beginning to fall apart. The Walsall gang may not have held territory in the way traditional gangs did, but their power came from fear, and they knew how to use it. The attack on Reedswood Lane was a public display of dominance intended to send a clear message. We can reach you anywhere, at any time. This wasn't just about injuring rivals. It was about showing the local community and other groups who held the upper hand in Walsall's underworld. Their choice of weapons reflected their mindset. Cricket bats and baseball bats weren't for precision, they were for spectacle. Machetes were meant to maim. The inclusion of a firearm raised the stakes even further. Firing into a vehicle at close range wasn't just reckless, it was an escalation. In that moment, they crossed a line from street violence to something approaching urban warfare. Power was also exercised in how the group coordinated. There was no single leader barking orders. Instead, there was a mutual understanding between the attackers, a shared intent to unleash brutality, backed by previous loyalty and street reputation. Each man knew his part, and each had reason to follow through. In these circles, backing out could mean retribution. The group thrived off silence and intimidation. Victims rarely spoke. Witnesses kept their heads down, and among their own, honor was built on loyalty and a willingness to act without hesitation. It was this code that kept the group together long enough to carry out the attack. For weeks, no one talked. No one gave up names. No one bragged too loudly. But control, no matter how violent, is always temporary. The gang had failed to consider one thing: how deeply the community and police would push back. The scale of the violence had crossed every line. It triggered a level of police response that overwhelmed the group's fragile discipline. In the end, the same fear they used to control others came back on them, this time in the form of evidence, arrests, and mounting charges. Their hold over Walsall didn't just weaken, it disintegrated. In the days following the ambush, the streets of Walsall fell quiet. But behind closed doors, a major investigation was already underway. West Midlands Police treated the incident not as a local dispute, but as a critical threat to public safety. The ferocity of the violence, the use of firearms, and the scale of the injuries left no room for leniency. This wasn't just another gang clash, it was an act of urban terrorism. The victims, despite their injuries, made it to hospital. That alone provided police with a critical start. Hospital staff documented extensive injuries: gunshot wounds, deep lacerations, broken bones. One man was placed in an induced coma. The forensic evidence on their clothing, along with medical analysis, helped investigators establish the number of weapons used and the likely distance of the gunfire. From there, the case began to build. Detectives gathered CCTV from homes, businesses, and traffic systems along the route to Reedswood Lane. They pieced together vehicle movements, tracked the convoy arriving, and matched timestamps with nearby phone activity. Crucially, mobile phone data placed several of the suspects near the scene at the exact time of the attack. Phone mast data, combined with ANPR, automatic number plate recognition, records, narrowed down potential users of each vehicle. Social media also played a role. Some of the suspects had posted cryptic updates or deleted accounts entirely in the days following the attack, behavior that raised red flags. Behind the scenes, detectives quietly built profiles, cross-referenced phone ownership, and began watching key addresses. Pressure mounted further when forensic teams identified DNA from some of the suspects on weapons and inside one of the vehicles later recovered. They'd been careful, but not careful enough. Sloppy disposal, minor slip-ups, and a wealth of digital traces began to unravel their silence. And then came the turning point. One suspect began to talk. The wall of loyalty cracked. That single decision gave police enough to execute warrants across Walsall and begin rounding up the group. The message was clear. The gang's grip on control was broken, and the noose was tightening. With a full surveillance picture in place and forensic links tightening around the suspects, West Midlands Police prepared for a series of coordinated strikes. The operation was planned with military precision. Officers from armed response units, local intelligence teams, and major crime detectives executed simultaneous raids at addresses across Walsall. They moved just before dawn, ensuring the suspects had no time to scatter or destroy evidence. At one property, Arma Shahzad was arrested without resistance. He had been under quiet observation for several days and was found with a phone believed to have been used during the planning of the attack. Muhammad Sajid, the oldest of the group at 38, was arrested a few miles away, where police found clothing matching descriptions taken from CCTV on the night of the assault. Cameron Moore, Shahzad Mahmood, Khurram Sajid, and Wahid Abbas were all arrested within a 24-hour window, some still living in the Walsall area. At least one of the suspects attempted to destroy a phone during the raid, but police recovered enough data from cloud backups and other devices to retain vital evidence. The eighth man, Umar Sadi, wasn't present during the ambush but was charged with assisting an offender. Evidence showed he had helped one of the attackers evade police in the aftermath, providing a place to lie low and disposing of potential evidence. His involvement, though secondary, was still integral to the gang's attempt to maintain silence and evade capture. As interviews began, some suspects maintained their innocence. But with CCTV footage, mobile phone mapping, DNA and eyewitness accounts all stacking up, the defense began to crumble. Prosecutors built a tight case around conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm with intent and possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. Facing a mountain of evidence, all 8 defendants ultimately chose to plead guilty before the trial began. The pleas avoided a lengthy and traumatic court process for the victims, but confirmed every detail of the gang's planning, execution, and intent. What had started as a carefully orchestrated strike designed to assert dominance had ended with every member of the group behind bars, awaiting sentencing. Their plan to scare and silence had failed, exposed by their own mistakes and dismantled by relentless police work. In April 2025, the men behind one of Walsall's most violent and premeditated gang attacks faced justice at Wolverhampton Crown Court. 8 defendants, having pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm and possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life, stood for sentencing. The victims, some still dealing with permanent injuries, sat in quiet reflection as the court detailed the events of that July night and the impact it had left behind. Armar Shahzad, 37, received 18 years. Described as a central figure in the planning, he helped coordinate the ambush and was tied directly to the firearm used. Muhammad Sajid, 38, received 16 years for his senior role and involvement in sourcing and transporting weapons. The judge remarked that both men had acted with clear forethought and shared intent to inflict maximum harm. Hezar Ayaz, only 20, was sentenced to 12 years, with the court acknowledging his youth but emphasizing that he had full knowledge of the plan and its consequences. Cameron Moore, 22, was handed 14 years, with CCTV showing him wielding a weapon during the attack. Shahzad Mahmood and Khurram Sajad received 13 and 12 years respectively, each confirmed to have been directly involved in the assault. Wahid Abbas, 28, also received 12 years. The 8th man, Umar Sadi, was not present during the ambush, but admitted to assisting an offender by helping one of the attackers lie low and disposing of evidence. He was sentenced to 5 years, with the judge noting the seriousness of obstructing justice in such a violent case. In total, the 8 men were jailed for over 100 years, a sentence that was welcomed by West Midlands Police. Inspector Francis Knox described the outcome as a strong message to others involved in gang activity. This was not random violence. It was a coordinated armed ambush in a residential area. These sentences reflect the weight of the damage they caused: physical, emotional, and societal. While justice was served, the case leaves deeper questions. The severity of the attack, the level of coordination, and the ease with which these men accessed weapons point to a broader issue of entrenched violence and gang culture in areas like Walsall. These weren't hardened gang leaders running national drug lines. They were local men with local grudges who chose maximum force to settle a dispute. And though none of their sentences seem unjust, it's worth asking how many others in similar networks go undetected until something this explosive happens. The courts can punish, but they can't undo the damage. One man remains in recovery from an induced coma. Another may never regain full mobility. Justice, in this case, was firm. But the deeper problem remains. 100 years in prison won't stop the next gang with a grudge and a weapon. It's a reckoning for these 8 men, yes, but also a reminder that prevention must come before the next flashpoint.